I never thought I would see the day that I make this sort of video about the Far Cry series. Growing up, Far Cry 2 was one of my favorite games of all time. I played it for hours on end and absolutely loved every second of it. There were some parts that my younger self could do without. Gun jams. But Far Cry 2 was honestly one of the games that made me have the view I have of games today. When games were lower resolution titles that were more focused on player enjoyment and interaction, over cutting corners, forced dopamine spikes, and microtransactions. Now, talking about Far Cry 2 is a bit weird for a video that's main focus is its sequel, 3 Games Down, that came out just under a decade later. But I think it's important for you all to understand where I stood with the Far Cry series. Far Cry 2 was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I would pay hundreds of dollars just to be able to replay it again for the first time. Then, Far Cry 3 came out, and the world fell in love with the series, just like how I fell in love with Far Cry 2. This was finally that big break for the Far Cry games, where it slowly was becoming a household name, but for the right reasons. Many were saying that Ubisoft had finally struck gold. Shit, some were even saying that they struck diamond. Meanwhile, I didn't play Far Cry 3 for the first 3 years of it coming out. It just didn't pique my interest in the same way the prequel did. And this isn't 21-year-old pretentious Will talking. This was 10-year-old pretentious Will. It was way easier to impress back then. Even at that young age, the game seemed like it was selling its soul to become more relevant, losing its nuance and jagged realism in exchange for a vague healing animation that only sometimes accurately guesses what caused you to take damage. From having to learn how to use an actual map while driving, or crashing, to fast traveling anywhere and having a pause menu with the map on display at all times. Looking back, I can easily tell you that these changes were definitely positive ones that made the series less intimidating for more casual enjoyers. And even I eventually capitulated and gave the game a try of my own. But I gotta say, it definitely didn't live up to the hype the gaming sphere had created around it. But it did bring one of the best villains ever created out into the spotlight, so for that I am eternally grateful. When I finished Far Cry 3, I knew that this was going to be the start of a slippery slope for the series, where more and more of the game's core features were going to be sacrificed to the gods of relevancy and ease of access. Anything to make a quick buck, and when all the hardcore gamers already bought your game, the only other market to go for are the casual gamers. And things like skill points and skinning animals for upgrades may be too scary for someone who likes the shooting McBang games of the world. I'm looking at you, Far Cry 6, but we'll get to you later in a much longer, much more depressing video. So then, what about Far Cry 5? Coming out in 2018, not too long after I had finished Far Cry 3 and 4 for the first time, you would think that me at 15 years old would drop everything to pick this well-known and established game series by now, right? Or at least, eventually just grab it when it's on sale or something. But you would be completely wrong. For one reason or another, I didn't play Far Cry 5 for a long time. Until 2022 on the PlayStation 5, and roughly for about 25 minutes. I smelled right away that something was wrong, because the intro was actually really good. You're a newly recruited deputy officer going on your first major bust to bring down infamous anarchist and cult leader Joseph Seed. You and your fellow peers board a helicopter, fly to the Seed residence, and slowly make your way to the church where Joseph can be found. Right away, I'm in. Slowly engrossing your players in a world completely foreign to not only them, but also the player character? Someone at Ubisoft definitely got a raise for this. Just beautiful writing that only serves to disappoint you. Because this is all you're gonna get. Forget a raise, that man must have been taken out to the back and killed, at least fired, because you never see anything like this again. At least, not enough to make you think there's hope for the rest of the game to come around. And this is Far Cry 5's biggest problem. It always succeeds in making you believe that it's going to get better. There are some parts of this game that were truly mesmerizing. Which brings me back to the intro. Back to where you and your fellow officers are arresting the head of this cult and escorting him to your helicopter. But no way. This can't be right. Something has to happen. This isn't Far Cry 4 where you can just stand around and the game ends for you. We literally have not had the chance to do anything else yet. There needs to be more. And this was the moment I knew I was going to be disappointed for the entire game. And not because this segment sucked, not because it failed to live up to the expectation I had created up until this point, but because it was fucking fantastic. You board the helicopter, and the cult shifts, now retaliating against you to take back their leader, slowly bombarding the helicopter with their own soon-to-be corpses until they successfully get it to crash. I thought this was going to be the story of a martyr, one that died in this crash and only inspired his followers to become 10 times worse than ever imaginable. But this is still Ubisoft, so honestly it's my fault for expecting some high quality writing like that. Disregarding the fact that Joseph Seed was able to perfectly avoid any forms of damage from this crash, because plot armor is so cool, while your colleagues are completely unconscious or at the least disoriented, this intro was more than enough to get me hooked for the game. So then why did they seemingly throw away all this momentum for the rest of it? After the intro sequence is fully done, which bears a striking resemblance to the opening of Far Cry 4 might I add, you wake up in a bunker where a man has rescued you. You can audibly hear the other passengers that were in your car getting taken by the cult just a few dozen feet to your left, but luckily due to Ubisoft magic, the person who found you wants nothing to do with the cult and even has his own little island bunker where he can take you. This is where the game introduces the resistance meter, a bar that slowly increases as you perform actions against the cult. This could be blowing up a shrine that the cult is prey to, or taking out high-ranking VIPs within the cult's ranks. So far, this isn't the worst thing in the world. It does remind me a lot of the Just Cause games where you would go around the town to blow up enemy equipment to hinder their progress in the main story, but I wouldn't say that Far Cry 5 is deliberately trying to rip off the Just Cause games. It honestly could just be a case of parallel thinking, and the concept itself is vague enough to where I would say that no one intellectual property can have full domain over the idea. My problem with Far Cry 5 isn't that the resistance meter exists, it's that the entire game ends up revolving around it. I only actually gave the game a decent try a few months ago, and I thought that it was going to be a nice change of pace to what I'm used to, where occasionally you would avoid directly going into missions in order to cause some damage to the cult. When in reality, the missions you do build up progress in that resistance meter, and important story missions only happen once you've reached certain milestones in the meter to begin with. This removed that sense of completion in me, as it no longer felt like something I wanted to do. Quick side note, when I play games nowadays, I always try to 100% them. Typically, I'll refrain from continuing the main quest line in order to finish side objectives or grab any relevant collectibles that are nearby. But when I was running around Hope County, I didn't feel like I was destroying silos or repelling enemy forces separate from the main quest. It felt like everything was just tied in with itself, and not going out of my way to do those things was an active hindrance to me making any sort of progress. I think that's why Far Cry 5 never really stood out to me, because I don't think it's a bad game. It's fun to load up Far Cry 5 and just run around blowing up the first thing you see, or liberating outposts like you would in the previous entries. One major change you'll notice immediately is that there aren't any more bell towers for you to climb and gain more knowledge about the surrounding area. At first, I really didn't like this change, but then I started to remember all those deaths from Far Cry 4 when the game decided that parkour was not something I was allowed access to. So overall, another good change. Something that I find myself saying about Far Cry 5 a lot. Which brings me to the most conflicting and frustrating part about the game. It's a game with a lot of fluff, but it made good changes in its gameplay. I felt almost overwhelmed whenever I would enter a new segment of the county, and I knew that it was going to consist of a lot more grinding, blowing up the same silos, doing the same types of missions, and barely getting any decent rewards for the trouble. But while I was doing it, I felt like the game was actually fun. However, it never really felt like I was accomplishing something by doing what the game wanted from me. I felt aimless, like my only objective was to see that little resistance meter go up, because for most of the game, it was. And then, there's the small glimpses of greatness again, those individual segments that would make me want to continue playing. There's maybe 4 or 5 of these in the entire game, but I'm only going to be covering one of them in case anyone watching this video hasn't finished playing through this 6-year-old game yet. Just in case. The first part of Hope County I cleared out was John Seed's portion. The youngest of the 4-man band of psychopaths that have taken over the county, whose entire ideology is borderline rapey and extremely controlling. Just say yes. It sounds like this guy took Barney's advice a little bit too seriously. Once you finish up filling that resistance meter, he openly invites you to fight him, and after chasing him down to his airfield, you get into one of those bad boys and blow him up sky high. Full disclosure, I hate dogfighting, but this one wasn't the worst thing I've ever encountered in a video game. Once he's dead, you go to his bunker to save one of your fellow officers from the beginning of the game. You slowly traverse the claustrophobic corridors filled with enemies as you search for your companion. These walls being extremely familiar to you as you had to break out of this place before from when John kidnapped you from making the resistance bar go up. You finally get to where the officer is, and she freaks out. Worried and all consumed by her fear that the torture was going to continue, she lashes out at you. Only a few seconds after does she realize who you even are. This is that good storytelling, the part of the game that wants to keep you invested, because this is real. I didn't feel like I was some badass that was ripping a hole through this cult. I felt like a peon who had become self-aware of the true war being fought. I felt like I was saving a friend who's stuck in this shitstorm with me. But I never felt anything like this again until the next encounter with one of the Seed siblings. Now to talk a little bit about the game's main antagonist. Joseph Seed is a very well written character. A strong villain that makes you question what you're actually doing by quote unquote liberating his disciples. And he's not some moral dilemma in the flesh, he's a real human being who you slowly see breaking down as you kill more of his family. I felt engaged when seeing the folly of this man. I felt personally responsible for every death I took because I could see the effects of it right in front of my own eyes. I just wish that I felt this way more than just 5% of the time. So ultimately, that's my biggest complaint against Far Cry 5. It's a fun shooting game that has enough meat and potatoes to keep the average fan engaged for the majority of the runtime. But sometimes that isn't enough. And if this game had those mechanics alongside a meaningless story, I would probably be much more forgiving when I talk about it. But it wasn't. There were flashes of greatness in there that were never fully utilized. And that's the real travesty of this game. I call Far Cry 5 a shallow experience not because it had nothing to offer, but because it had so much to offer that the developers just refused to give to us. If I were making this review in 2019, I would say that this is a good sign for things to come. Looking forward, we can expect games of this quality or better. But seeing how Far Cry 6 is just worse in every single aspect, I think it's fair to say that Far Cry 5 is the last decent Far Cry game we're ever gonna see again. Rest in peace, Far Cry. You brought me some of my fondest memories growing up, and you will be missed.